Ever feel like, kids these days are growing up like really differently?
Mm.
Like maybe childhood itself has changed.
Yeah, definitely.
We're diving deep into Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation today
Oh, good one.
to uncover what's going on and what we can do about it.
Love it.
So this book's core thesis is super interesting. Basically, it says Gen Z's mental health struggles, all that anxiety and depression stuff.
Right.
It's linked to two things. Being overprotected out in the real world, like super sheltered childhoods.
Interesting.
But then, at the same time, underprotected online. Especially since, like, smartphones exploded onto the scene, what was that, 2010, 2015?
Yeah, right around there.
And the thing is, Haidt doesn't just point fingers and say, oh, bad parents, bad internet. He actually gives us steps we can take, like families, schools, even just us, as individuals.
Absolutely. He really empowers the reader.
Okay, so right off the bat, chapter 1, he hits us with these, like, shocking stats.
Oh, yeah.
Depression, anxiety, self-harm, all that. Just skyrocketed for kids born after 1995.
It's pretty alarming, isn't it?
And for some reason, it's hitting girls the hardest.
Interesting.
Which, by the way, this isn't just an American thing. It's happening across a lot of Western nations.
Really makes you think there's got to be some common thread there, right?
Exactly, some common cause.
Yeah.
So Haidt, at first, he thought, okay, it's social media. That's the villain.
That's like the obvious culprit.
Right. But then he's like, wait a minute. It's actually this deeper thing, the shift to a phone-based childhood.
Yeah.
It's like the phone becomes the central, like, organizing principle of their life. And it's not just the device itself. It's how it changes everything.
Yeah, how they experience the world.
Right, exactly. And that takes us to chapter 2, where he talks about discover mode.
Okay.
And this was fascinating to me. Like, think back to when we were kids. Just that freedom to, like, explore, experiment, get into a little trouble,
Yeah, those were the days.
He's saying that unstructured play, that's how kids' brains actually wire up for learning, for risk assessment, for social skills, all that stuff.
Makes sense. You can't really replicate that through a screen.
No, not at all. And it's the opposite of defend mode.
Which
It's like being constantly on guard, risk averse. And he says a lot of overprotective parenting, even though it's well-intentioned, ends up trapping kids in this defend mode.
So it backfires.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, is this like just our modern world messing things up, or is it something deeper? And that's where he brings in this idea of gene culture coevolution.
That's chapter 3, right?
Yeah, and it's a total mind bender. So he's challenging this idea that, like, human biology is destiny. Like, we're not just programmed to develop in a certain way. We need specific experiences to actually thrive.
So nature and nurture, not just one or the other.
Exactly. And those experiences, they've changed drastically in recent decades.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. The way kids grow up today is so different from even just a generation ago.
Right. So can you give us an example of how this, like, plays out in real life?
Sure. So imagine a kid learning to walk. Their genes give them the blueprint for walking, but they need the environment, the chance to practice, to fall, to get back up. In the past, kids had tons of opportunities for that just through free play. Nowadays, with structured activities and screens, those opportunities are shrinking.
So it's not that kids aren't capable of learning, we're just not giving them the right environment to do it.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so this brings us to a concept that might seem counterintuitive. Anti-fragility. It's chapter 3.
Anti-fragility. What's that?
It's like, bear with me here, but it's the idea that kids are like systems that actually get stronger when they encounter some stress, not by being totally shielded from it.
That is counterintuitive.
Right. But he uses the analogy of our immune systems. If you're never exposed to germs, your body can't build up antibodies to fight off illness. Same thing with kids. If they're never challenged, they don't develop resilience.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
It's not about throwing them to the wolves, obviously, but giving them manageable challenges to overcome.
Right.
And this reminds me of the decline in what he calls risky play. Climbing trees, exploring without adults, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, we used to do that all the time.
Exactly. And it's not just about fun. It's how we learn to assess risk, to problem solve, to trust ourselves.
Yeah, nowadays.
Kids are just not getting those opportunities.
Right. It's also structured and supervised.
Yeah.
Which brings us to, I think, the big turning point in the book, chapter 4, where Haidt really zeroes in on puberty.
Puberty, the teenage years.
Yeah.
Fun times.
Not always, but developmentally, it's crucial. It's like a second sensitive period. The brain's rewiring, lessons stick more. It's prime time for becoming an adult. But are we giving kids the right experiences for that?
Good question. Like back in the day, there were these rites of passage,
Yeah.
Clear markers of adulthood. What do we have now?
Not much, really. It's a lot more blurry, a lot more drawn out.
It's fascinating how he compares human development to, like, a caterpillar turning into a butterfly.
Interesting analogy.
So the caterpillar, it just transforms automatically, right? But humans, we need the right cultural input at the right time. Otherwise, the transition gets messed up.
So we're like butterflies stuck in their cocoons.
Kind of. And this is where the lure of the screen becomes even more of a problem. Chapter 5, he digs into this whole designed addiction thing.
Designed addiction.
Yeah, it's not just kids being lazy. It's like these devices, especially smartphones, they're engineered to hook us. He talks about the hooked model with triggers, actions, variable rewards. It's like a slot machine in your pocket, man.
Always vying for our attention.
Constantly. And there's this chilling quote from an early Facebook exec where he basically admits their goal was to consume as much of our time as possible. Scary stuff.
Wow, that is chilling.
Right. And even when kids experience flow online, that super focused state, Haidt says it's often lacking that real-world challenge, that thing that builds character.
Because it's all virtual.
Yeah. Like, think of the difference between mastering a level in a video game versus, like, building a treehouse with your friends. Both can be engaging, but the treehouse, that involves real problem-solving, collaboration, physical effort.
You're getting your hands dirty, literally.
Exactly. Okay, now we got to talk about the gender differences here.
Yeah.
Chapter 6, it's all about why this is hitting girls so much harder.
Let's get into it.
So, the stats are brutal. Girls' self-satisfaction just plummets as social media use goes up. It's like there's this disconnect between the perfect online world and their real lives.
Yeah, that pressure to present a perfect image online can be really damaging.
Totally. And Haidt uses this term, the sociometer, which is basically everyone's internal gauge for how accepted we feel socially.
Like a social barometer.
Yeah. And for girls, especially during puberty, which is already a vulnerable time, their sociometer just goes haywire online.
Makes sense. They're constantly bombarded with images and messages that make them question their worth, their appearance, their whole identity.
Exactly. It's like a pressure picker. And it's no wonder their self-esteem takes a hit.
So then the question becomes, what about the boys? Are they immune to all of this?
Great question. And that's chapter 7, the push-pull explanation. He's saying boys are being pushed away from the real world, fewer male role models, less emphasis on physical play.
Okay, I see.
But then, at the same time, they're being pulled into the digital world.
Why what?
Video games, for one. They offer mastery, competition, even, pornography becomes accessible. It's like this perfect storm.
Where the real world loses its appeal.
Yeah. And while it might look like boys are having fun online, their mental health is suffering too.
So it's not just a girl's problem, it's a generational one.
Exactly. But the good news is, now that we're starting to understand the problem, we can start looking for solutions. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next part of this deep dive. We'll unpack Haidt's proposed solutions and talk about how we can all take action to reclaim childhood and help kids thrive.
Sounds good. I'm in.
Awesome. Stay tuned.
Definitely. Okay, so we've talked about the problem, right? Now, let's dive into what Haidt suggests we can actually do about it.
Yeah, because it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this, right?
Totally. But the cool thing is, Haidt doesn't just leave us hanging with all this doom and gloom. He actually lays out a bunch of solutions, and they're not like pie-in-the-sky stuff either. They're actually pretty doable.
So where do we even begin?
Well, he starts by tackling this whole culture of safetyism. The idea that we need to protect kids from every little bump and bruise.
Oh, yeah, like the helicopter parenting thing.
Exactly. And he argues that while it's coming from a good place, it can actually backfire and make kids more fragile in the long run.
Because they never learn to deal with discomfort or risk on their own.
Precisely. So one thing he suggests is gradually giving kids more independence, like let them walk to school alone if it's safe, or play at the park without you hovering over them.
So it's about building trust, both in our kids and in the world around us.
Exactly. And this ties into his bigger point about rebuilding trust in communities and institutions, because when trust breaks down, what takes over? Fear.
And fear leads to even more overprotective parenting.
Right. It's this vicious cycle. So we need to find ways to create spaces where kids can interact freely without adults constantly breathing down their necks. He talks about adventure playgrounds, which are popular in Europe.
Those sound cool. What are they like?
They often have natural elements, loose parts, tools, basically stuff that lets kids build, explore, take risks in a relatively safe environment.
It's like those sorts we used to build as kids. Remember, we just used whatever we could find, and it was Messy, maybe a little dangerous, but so much fun.
Exactly. We were learning problem solving, collaboration, all that good stuff without even realizing it.
And it brings us back to those rites of passage we were talking about
Yeah.
earlier. Like, how do we recreate those in a way that makes sense for kids today?
Yeah, it's not like we can just throw them into some ancient tribal ritual, right?
Yeah.
Haidt suggests looking at those traditional cultures for inspiration, but also creating new rituals that fit with modern life, like maybe a community service project, a wilderness trip, even just a family ceremony to acknowledge a young person's growth.
I love that. It's about marking those transitions in a meaningful way. Okay, so we've talked about parents, communities. What about schools? What's their role in all of this?
Big one. Haidt argues that schools need to shift their focus beyond just academics and prioritize character development and social emotional skills.
Which are arguably even more important for success in life, right?
Totally. He suggests incorporating things like mindfulness practices, character education programs, even outdoor learning experiences into the curriculum.
So it's a more holistic approach to education.
Exactly. And it all comes back to building those core skills that kids need to thrive: self-awareness, empathy, resilience.
Makes sense. But it sounds like a lot of these solutions require like a collective effort.
Hmm.
It's not just on parents or schools, it's on all of us, right?
Absolutely. Haidt talks about the importance of social capital, which basically means strong connections and trust within communities. It could be anything from organizing neighborhood events to just getting to know your neighbors.
It's about bringing back that it takes a village mentality.
And here's where it gets really interesting. He believes Gen Z, the very generation facing these challenges, is actually in a unique position to lead this change.
Because they're the ones experiencing it firsthand.
Exactly. Plus, they're digital natives. They know how to organize and mobilize online. But he also cautions against the pitfalls of online call-out culture and polarization. So it's about teaching them how to use those tools for good, how to engage in respectful dialogue, even when they disagree.
Which means we have to model those behaviors too, right? We
Yeah.
can't just lecture them about it. We have to show them how it's done.
Totally. And that includes being aware of how addictive these online platforms are designed to be. We talked about that earlier.
Yeah, the hook model and all that.
Right. It's about using technology consciously, intentionally, both as individuals and as families.
Which also means staying informed about the research, being open to adapting our strategies, and having those open conversations with kids about their online experiences, both good and bad.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process. But ultimately, it comes down to each of us taking action, whether it's talking to our kids about social media, advocating for changes at their schools, or just being more mindful of our own tech use. Every step counts.
Because it's not just about fixing things for kids today, it's about creating a better world for all of us.
Exactly. And a lot of these trends Haidt highlights, they're not just kid problems, they're adult problems too. Anxiety, loneliness, distrust, we're all dealing with this stuff.
So as we move into the final part of this deep dive, I'm curious, what's really resonated with you so far? What ideas have stood out?
Honestly, what really hits home for me is how this book, it's not just about raising kids, it's about all of us, you know? Like, how do we stay human in a world that's becoming so tech-driven?
Right, like are we losing something essential along the way?
Yeah, exactly. It's like Haidt's calling us to reevaluate our values, what we prioritize, and the kind of future we're building, not just for the next generation, but for ourselves, too.
It's easy to get caught up in the daily grind and lose sight of the big picture, right?
Yeah.
Those fundamental things like connection, meaning, even just joy.
Absolutely. Those are the building blocks of a fulfilling life, no matter your age. And they're also what make a society strong and resilient, able to face challenges and adapt.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the anxious generation, what's the one message you hope listeners take away from all this?
That we have a choice. We're not just passive bystanders in all of this. We can choose how we raise our kids, how we use technology, how we shape the world around us.
It's about taking back control, right?
Exactly. So I challenge every listener to ask themselves, what's one small step I can take today to bring back that sense of wonder, that discover mode, either for myself or for the kids in my life?
It could be as simple as putting down the phone and going for a walk in nature, right?
Totally. Or having an honest conversation with your kid about what's going on online, or even just like rethinking how you approach risk and challenge in your own life.
Yeah, we have to model what we want to see.
Absolutely. And it could be something bigger too, like starting a community garden, volunteering at a school, advocating for policies that actually support well-being.
The possibilities are endless once you start thinking about it. And you don't have to do it all at once. Just start small and see where it leads.
Exactly. And if you're looking for more guidance, definitely check out The Anxious Generation. It's packed with research and practical advice.
And don't forget to connect with us. Let us know what actions you're taking, big or small. We'd love to hear from you. We're all in this together, and we can learn so much from each other.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into reclaiming childhood and building a more resilient future. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep taking action.